Hello, welcome to Radio Free Gastonia, the internet's number one source for unreliable, uh, just good enough emergency historical content. I'm your host, Alex, as you know. I've been thinking a lot about this conversation I had with a friend of mine, friend of the pod. That's actually an ancient Ukrainian name, friend of the pod. Who was thinking a lot about some of the literature on the history of capitalism, right? And we were talking about Christopher Clark's book, which I think is called The Roots of Rural Capitalism, something like that. It's about like the early republic in the United States, and I guess the northern states, and how this distinctive form of capitalism evolved. And this gets to a bigger question about like what does capitalism mean? When did capitalism begin? Was the Old South or the like early slave South capitalist, or was it something else? There are people like Eugene Genovese who wrote Roll Jordan Roll, which is a classic book in the field of history and the field of studies of the U.S. South and the study of slavery. I feel like this is a little bit of a wearisome debate. Personally, I've always felt that way. There are people like Walter Johnson, Walter Johnson, I think, who've written wonderful books, like River of Dark Dreams, that are part of this debate over, like, was the Old South capitalist or not? A movie that is part of the spiritual basis of Tropics of Meta, because we're all obsessed with it, is 1997 or 1998's Good Will Hunting, where Matt Damon as Will Hunting has an epic debate with like the best portrayal of a Harvard graduate student ever, the Michael Bolton ass motherfucker, who's like, well, actually, I think that the economy of South Carolina and slavery was actually a pre-market. It's like, no, shut up, you stupid idiot. And Matt Damon puts him in his place, which we all love. But I think it's very indicative of the fact that, these debates seem very pedantic to me. I was trying to talk to my friend about this and figure out, like, well, what are we trying to figure out? Like, when does Southern slavery tip over from pre-capitalism or non-capitalism into capitalism? Like, when does this happen? It's like, well, do we go back to the 17th century with the establishment of slavery in what is now the U.S. South? Do we go back to the 14th century with the development of, like, double entry, like, bookkeeping in Genoa? I was recently teaching a class where we talked quite a bit about, we were talking about, like, the French school of thought, the Annalist school. Fernard Braudel, who famously wrote an 1,800-page book that I pretended to read in grad school. I actually really do like him. I think he's cool. Like, how cool can you be when you, like, literally write an 1,800-page book on little scraps of paper from memory in a POW camp? That's very cool. But Marc Bloch, like, members of this French historical school of thought, and they were trying to, like, look at this longer, like, different modes of time. So, like, one of the things that Braudel did in his book, The Mediterranean, is to say, well, like, there's this level of time that is deep and geological and like meteorological, like like climate changes. Before there was like carbon-based climate change, but just like there's if you think of history as being like a geological strata, and like there's one level that is deep and long and enduring that unfolds over the course of centuries. And then you think of there's a second level of historical change that happens um, based on economic things like cycles of the market, like the price of wheat or the price of rice or something in the 16th or 18th or 19th century. Like those things, those economic structural cycles kind of unfold over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then the lower strata of the whole thing is what happens in politics, what we would normally think of as history, especially back in like the 1920s or 30s. That like, oh well, King Leopold decided to chop off the left ankle of every black man in Congo. Okay, well that's a news item. Okay, so now we have 10 tips to slim up before swimsuit season. Like that kind of like very granular, like day to day kind of reporting or news, or just like what's happening in the news. Like there's the news, then there are these economic cycles, and there are these like environmental, geological kind of cycles or meteorological or whatever. And so Braudel introduced this idea in the Mediterranean, and I think it's a very long book, but I thought it was very insightful in sort of distinguishing the way we understand different types of historical change. So I give him a lot of credit for that. Still, though, like a big part of this historical tradition that looks at world systems. Immanuel Wallerstein is one of the big scholars in that field, or was. And I guess my point is like taking this question back all the way, like where does it begin? Where does it end? What's important about like making this point that well, capitalism began in the U.S. South in 1620, or capitalism began in Genoa in the 14th century. Like, what does matter about that? Because there are people, scholars like Giovanni Arrighi and other folks could make a pretty strong point that like there was a big turning point that happened in early modern Europe. That happened in Italy, well, what is now Italy? It wasn't called Italy back then, but that there were these like financial arrangements, there were these credit and debt instruments. There was this approach to like just something as simple as accounting and bookkeeping. I'm not trying to say it's simple, but I mean something so like seemingly ordinary that like, oh yeah, like what if we had double ledger like bookkeeping? Like what if we kept track of how much money we're bringing in? Or what if we got rid of usury laws and started charging interest? And what if we had like mercantile associations like that kept track of these things? A lot of those things came out of what is now Italy in the early modern period, like the 14th century. So you could say like that is, I mean, Arrighi in books like the long 20th century would strongly make the case that that's really when capitalism began. So like what difference does it make whether capitalism began in the 18th century in the United States or in the 1840s, or when did capitalism begin? To me, seems like not such an important question. But then I guess the question would be, what is the important question? And I think that's the thing that historians, other scholars, journalists, writers would be well placed to ask, which is like, so what are we talking about here? When you look at slavery in the United States South, when you look at it in Brazil or the Caribbean. Um, I don't know if is this capitalism is the important question to be asking. These are bad people doing bad shit. Um, I've recently been watching the film Sankofa, and it gives you a very clear and jarring sense of like what the difference between the 1990s and the sort of early 19th century or 18th century were like. That this evil, disgusting, horrible system was put into place, and whether it's capitalist or not, like really seems like the essence of a semantic debate. So anyway, I mean, it is important to think about like how capitalism evolves. I think that books like Christopher Clark's or Stuart Blumin's book on the rise of the middle class in the 19th century, Mary Ryan's book as well, about a similar place and time, Crucible of the middle class. I think that like it is very important to think about like, well, what gives rise to the capitalist industrial system that, or Fordist system maybe, that came out of the United States in the mid to late 19th century. There's like an institutional environment. There are like rules, there are systems, there are financial systems, there are like institutional norms and laws that make it possible for people to invest and gamble, in a way, like to take money they already have in hand and then invest it in something else, assuming that like the government or someone will make them whole, or at the very least, like this won't be literally stolen from me by force. If something bad happens, I can declare bankruptcy, or once you get to the 1930s, like your FDIC protections, things like that. So there really is like a serious conversation to be had about like how does that ecosystem of institutional norms get created that allows people to invest in potentially risky ventures, to be capitalists, basically, to like really like invest in the new Hewlett Packard or Apple or Google or something, like, and not assume that like they're going to be gangsterfied by an oligarch or a mob boss who's just going to come and take it away from them. So that, like, the ecosystem of institutional norms is actually very important. But I do think it's kind of different from this discussion about like when did capitalism begin or was slavery capitalist. Like those just don't seem like very important questions to me. Having said that, I think that I think Eric Foner's book, Free Labor, Free Men, Free Soil, probably getting the order of those words wrong, but like Eric Foner is really looking at like how does the ideology come out of this. I think this is something that one of my mentors, Barbara Fields, really talks about too. Is like there's an ideological, there's like an explanatory schema of like, well, okay, so we have slaves, so like the world looks like this, or I'm a Ben Franklin, or I'm a mechanic in Philly in the 1790s, and I've made some money like working on people's like wagons or something, and I can take that money and then start a business and then like retire as a gentleman farmer or something like that, like that series of steps that people think, oh well, like it's yeah, okay, cool. Like I'm living in an environment where like a bunch of white guys in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Western New York in the early 19th century think like, okay, I can do this. There's an environment that exists where I can like invest and start a business and accumulate capital without fear of like being really defrauded, which I think was different in the South because you had the slave power, you had an extremely hierarchical and unequal society. Where, yeah, like you did actually, if you were a white man, you probably thought that, yeah, the rich white slave owner actually can take all your stuff. Or if you were a black man or woman, and you just knew that like you had no rights and you would not be regarded or treated fairly. So I like the development of those legal and institutional norms. I think are very important, but it still seems pretty different from this question of like, oh, something capitalist or not. Like I don't know. Like it's all just a bunch of bad people doing bad shit, and it still is. So anyway, this is Radio Free Gastonia coming to you live in action from downtown Whittier, California. All right, I'll see you next time.